I've been practicing medicine for over 25 years, and I've seen it. The world is hurting, people are sick, and even with our greatest scientific discoveries and technological breakthroughs, trends in health are not getting better. We weren't designed for this. This world as we know it, it's not our home. But there is a remedy. Our Creator designed us to be resilient creatures, and He's given us clues in the scriptures that have dramatic implication for our lives today. Let's talk about biblical prescriptions. Let's take a serious look at living as God intended. Are you ready? Let's get well, and let's go home.
Welcome to the Biblical Prescriptions for Life podcast. I'm your host, Nick Evanson, and on today's podcast, you'll be hearing a presentation from Dr. James L. Markham, author of the 7-week Bible study program, Biblical Prescriptions for Life, on how worship affects our physiology. As always, the advice given in this podcast is not intended to replace the care of your primary physician, and Dr. Markham insists that listeners talk with their doctor before making changes to their health care regimen. If you like what you hear in this podcast, we encourage you to find us online at biblicalprescriptions.com/podcast for a free offer, as well as a discount on the Biblical Prescriptions for Life study materials. Thanks again for joining us today, and let us know your comments on this podcast at biblicalprescriptions.com/podcast. Enjoy the presentation.
This seminar here is going to be one of the most interesting ones that we've done today, but at the same time, it's going to require everyone to put on their thinking caps and also to really ask the Holy Spirit to sort of show you what's going on. This is a little bit complicated. We talk a little bit about science and genetics, and not everyone understands this, and some people haven't had a science background. But if you look back, I tell you, the technology has changed so much through the years, and nothing that I learned back in medical school am I using today. And one of the only things constant in the world is change. And not only does things change in the health world, but things change in the spiritual world. The way we reach people, the way we interact, the way we love people. All of this, the only thing that constant, it seems like, is change. So in this seminar, the time together, I'm going to spend some time talking about the physiology of worship. We've talked about why we're sick, the chronic stressors as we change from our original design. We've talked about how the chronic stress in the world's gone up. The chronic disease has gone up. I hope I've convinced you that the current models are not sustainable and not working for chronic disease, but there is a place for modern medicine, mainly treating causes, getting us over the humps. It's also very valuable in treating stress we can't do anything about, genetic stress. It's very valuable. But I want to introduce to you the physiology of worship today. This might be something you've never heard before, because not a lot of medical doctors are talking about this. It's not being part of the crowd. It's thinking outside of the box. But I hope as you look at the evidence and listen to the authority, the ultimate physician, that he will let you know whether this is truth and whether you can introduce it into your life. But it doesn't stop there. We're all called to do something more. We all have a greater mission. And hopefully as you learn these tools, if you believe in it, you can pass them on to your friends and neighbors. And also help them to treat their bodies through the treatment of worship. And you're going to see how the physical and the spiritual really are not able to be separated. It's hard to have one and not the other. So we're going to talk about the physiology of worship. And worship is the most important biblical prescription for life. How many of you are familiar with Matthew 11, verse 28? This text has sustained me on many nights where things were tough. Come unto me, all ye labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Well, let's break that down a little bit. What does come to me mean? Remember, we have often words that explain things that are more complex. What does the word faith mean? What does the word stress mean? What does the words come to me mean? Well, we mere humans use words to explain complex interactions and physiology in the body. Come to me, have a relationship with me, worship with me, be with me, walk with me. God asks us to do that. All you labor and are heavy laden. Well, you could say that is maybe heavy laden. That sounds like stress, maybe chronic stress. Maybe we have a treatment here for chronic stress. Come to me, all ye labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you a gift of rest. So be with me, chronic stress, and I will give you rest. And when people come to me in the office, I explain to him that rest is just not physical rest, even though that's important. We were designed to have physical rest. Work 6 days a week, rest 1 day. That's how we were designed. We were designed to work during the day and rest at night. Edison messed that up with the light bulb. We stay up and watch TV all the time. We put a chronic stressor on us. Then we put the media on us, another stressor. Well, we were designed to work and rest. This is our template. And if we don't do that, our body can't heal. It puts a chronic stressor on our body. So in people with chronic disease, I say, are you resting? Are you getting physical rest? Are you getting mental rest? How many have a bombarded mental? Are you having hobbies, doing things that are fun? It's okay to have fun. It's good for us. It gives our mind a break. I take care of quite a few ministers. And I notice there are some ministers here today. They're under lots of stress. And I say, it's okay to take a day off and have fun. You don't have to be available 24/7. Oh, I heard an amen there. It's okay. Go out on the boat, have some fun, watch some football. We're designed that, and it's a gift from God. He's going to give us the physical, the spiritual rest when we come to Him. And the third type of rest that I make sure they're having to change their chemistry is the spiritual rest. We were designed to be with our Creator. When we don't have that, it puts a chronic stressor on our bodies to some degree. And we're going to explain the physiology of that as we go along today. So you say, if come unto me, worship, they're mere words. Well, let's look back. We've looked back through history before to see what history's done. Let's look back through history again. We talked about the food history. We talked about other history. Let's see what worship was through the ages. Well, how did Adam worship in the Bible? Well, did he have a church to go to? No. Did he have a Bible to read? Well, I don't think so. Well, Adam worshiped by being outside, taking care of creation, spending time with his lovely wife Eve, and also he was able to spend time with God and walk with God. Wow. That's the type of worship that I vote for, okay? I want to be in the garden, be outside and worship and see nature and just spend time with God and my wife's son. That's the kind of worship that I vote for. Well, that was the way Adam worshiped, and we're going to find out that worship is a word that represents physiology, and that's changed over time. How did Enoch worship? Well, unfortunately in the Bible, we don't have a book of Enoch. I wish we did have a book with Enoch. But if you remember, Enoch walked with God. He walked with God. So when they went places on their journey, guess who was with them all the way? God. When he took one step at a time, who was with him? God. You've heard of the ministry of presence. Sometimes just being there is all that is needed. Well, he and God were together. In fact, their relationship grew so much that guess what? Took him to heaven. That's how Enoch worshiped. Well, what about Noah? How did Noah worship? You know, do you think he had a worship in building that boat? You think he had a church to go to where people were excited about what he was saying? I don't think so, but I'm sure that God found a way to worship. It might have been he worshiped as he did God's bidding. That's a form of worship, as he built the ark. But he found a way to worship to connect with God. What about Stephen? Remember Stephen? His worship was so strong that it changed his brain. His prefrontal cortex, the anti-stress, the loving part of his brain was so developed, and his midbrain, the stress part of his brain, was turned down so much that when people were stoning him to death, when people were causing terrible physical harm, not only was he able to think, but he was able to love. And he asked them he forgave them. Well, there was physiology behind that. There was reasons he was able to do that. And I would like to think a lot of it was from his worship and how God changed his mind. So worship has changed throughout time. And everyone here worships and connects with God in different ways. We have our cultural worship. We have our personal worship. But worship really represents a word that explains complex physiology in the brain and in our very DNA. There's many different methods of worship. We talked about Bible study, a great way to worship. But some people can't read and write. There's other forms of worship, prayer, talking to God. That's a great way to worship. We've prayed here today. Many people live in constant prayer. There's service. As you've done these to the least of these, you've done it unto me. Service, a form of worship. Of course, giving thanks and praising. Getting up and being thankful for what we have. Praise. David did a lot of praising in his worship. This has been well documented. Praise is a form of worship. Some people like to worship in nature. I talked to several scientists, and they feel closest to God when they're out studying his creation and seeing how wonderfully it's made and put together. I would like to think that caring for your body, this vehicle that's going on a trip, is a form of worship when you do it for the right reasons. Remember, it's why we do things. Caring for your body for the right reasons. I would like to think that is worship. I'd like to think we're learning things that bring us into better caring for our bodies. And I'd like to think today that as we spent this time together, when we're meeting with each other, that this is a form of worship. And through this time together, we're having tangible changes in our very DNA. How many feel like we're worshiping today? How many feel like we're getting a health lecture today? How many feel like we're doing a little bit of both? How many don't even know why they're here? They just happen to wander in. Don't raise your hand. The brain is very complicated. In fact, President Obama is going to spend a lot of money on the brain trying to uncover the secrets. We've already sequenced our genetic material. That's the DNA. So here's a brain here, and the lower part of the brain where you see the spinal cord comes up, that's the part of the brain, the lower part of the brain that we share with reptiles. That and the midbrain are the stress part of the brain that turns on this stress chemistry, the chronic chemistry. The higher parts of the brain that are unique to humans shares the part that gives us love, that treats us empathy, compassion, how to organize complex thoughts, how to think about abstract things. This is the part of the brain that we want to develop. And unfortunately, as the chronic stress has risen through the years, this part of our brain has had more problems. People can't think as well anymore. We don't figure things out quite as well. The chronic stresses of the world, yes, has damaged our part of the brain that worships with God, the prefrontal cortex. Well, let's look at some of the research regarding worship. We have all sorts of new technology now that we've never had before. MRI machines, CAT scans. We've had the ability to study the metabolism in the brain. We also have the ability to study the electricity in the brain. We have not had this technology for years ago. In fact, it's only been in the recent years that we know that the brain has 3 structural functional layers. And as we've had the technology, the imaging techniques to study the brain, we can know what our DNA is doing in our brain. So the DNA does something and our brain changes, our brain does something all the time. Our brain is constantly working. Now, hopefully, the part of our brain that's working the most today is our prefrontal cortex. That's the thinking, that's the figuring things out. Because we're going to go into some interesting research now that's been done by Dr. Andrew Newberg. Dr. Andrew Newberg is a medical doctor that's really interested in brain research, and he's at the University of Pennsylvania. And once we have developed the ability to image the brain, he wanted to study the brain under different circumstances to see if different things would harm the brain. And before they started the research of alcohol, that harmed the brain. Cocaine, alcohol, that harmed the brain. They found that chronic stress hurt the brain. But he started to study worship and how it affects the brain. And he actually has studied people that have never worshiped before. And just by teaching them to worship for 12 minutes for 2 months, he saw remarkable changes in the prefrontal cortex in the brain. He studied the brains, the PET scans, some of the scans of the brain, both before and after worship. And after worship, he noted that structures in the brain started to become more metabolically active. The brain is very complex, 100 billion neurons, 1 quadrillion interconnections. That's 1 with 15 zeros after it. The brain is much more complex than the internet. So figuring the brain out is going to be very complex, and yet we know the brain is so important because we talked about when we're under stress, the brain takes over and starts to do things. So if we want to deal with chronic stress that we've talked about causes to be sick, we have to learn about the brain and what makes the brain do better. Well, he started doing this research on the brain that's so complex, and he saw all these chemicals, that the brain got bigger, more metabolically active in the part of the brain that I call the love part of the brain, the God part of the brain. And guess what? The parts of the lower brain that we talked about, where the amygdala sits, where the limbic system sits, where all the stress chemistry and people that worship, that began to decrease. Less neurons, less metabolic activities. So he was able to study these brains, and he looked at these fancy scans, and he studied the brains of people that worship and noticed there was a physical change in the brain. It got better. The people got smarter. But not only that, he measured the neurotransmitters of the brain, the chemicals that remember we talked about serotonin. Worship increased that chemical. It increased oxytocin. It increased endorphins. And it decreased the stress chemistry in the body by worshiping a mere 12 minutes for 2 months. Well, we now have the technology to prove some of these things that God said in His Word. Just a little bit of the technology. Well, can you imagine taking an individual and studying them and say, listen, young man, I'm going to study the way you worship and find out the way you worship best and design a worship program just for you. It might be 20 minutes of Bible study, 10 minutes of outside, whatever. Everyone worships in different ways, but we know it's this path of worship that changes the brain. We have the science to prove it. It turns down chronic stress. But remember, when the brain's working better and thinking better, we're more likely to see other truths and do other things. The mental processes and the physical processes go together. Well, he's done this research on many people. And now we know in this book, How God Changes Your Brain, shows all the scans of people who worship, the different modes of worship, and how it literally turns on the neurons, makes new connections, develops the brain, but more importantly, it turns down the stress chemistry. And the specific part of the brain that he's been so interested in is called the anterior cingulate cortex. Many scientists have named this the God brain. They think this is where God might communicate with us. The people that worship have this part of the brain grow more. They can love more. They empathize more. They care more. They turn down the chronic stress chemistry. When they do this, turn down the chronic stress chemistry, guess what? The chance of every chronic disease developing goes down. Remember, we talked about those chronic diseases: heart disease, cancer, stroke, dementia, all improve when we worship because it turns down the stress chemistry. So you say to yourself, wow, that makes sense. I want to worship more. I want to worship better. I want to learn how to worship. Well, we talked about how worship has been done in the past. And the greatest example of worship is Christ. And as we study Christ, I think he brings us into understanding worship in a life. Now, if that research wasn't interesting, there's even more interesting work out there on a much smaller basis. Remember, the brain changes. There's new interconnections. The stress chemistry goes down. The new brain develops. What you ask, well, how does that happen? How does that occur? Well, recently, we now have ability to study the DNA. We didn't have this 50 years ago. Remember, we now can sequence the DNA. The 54,000 genes in our DNA, we now know what they're doing. It's very exciting. The genes are what turns on a host of things that turn on the brain changes. And it's important that we talk about this for a few minutes. Francis Collins was one of the doctors that helped sequence these 54,000 genes. And he wrote a book called The Language of God. And he thinks that God's voice is explained by our DNA. And remember, it's our DNA that through transcription and translation and making messenger DNA and proteins and enzymes, this complex regulation turns on these uphill changes that change the structure of our brain, that turns on and off these stress chemicals. This is a protein molecule. This is the building blocks of our behavior. So that's why when I say the word worship, well, what does worship really mean? Well, this is a complex changes that's happening in our brains, our neural connections that we're just beginning to understand. Well, when we say stress, this is a complex chemical reaction that's happening in our body that turns on these things via these neural pathways. This is much more complex than we could ever imagine. The more I learn, the less I know. I just see that God is opening up new avenues for us to connect with Him, and not only do that, but to spread His love and His gospel. Because remember, all of the physical truths that we learn back, the water, the living water, the light of the world, the bread of life, all the physical points to the spiritual, the worship. Now, you're going to have to follow me a little bit close because this gets complicated now. And I'm going to do the best I can. This is the first time I've ever explained this on television. Dr. Dusek works at Harvard University with Herbert Benson. And Herbert Benson has been along for years. In fact, he was the one that did the original studies that showed that when our body's restful and relaxation, there's remarkable physical changes. And a belief system is very important to our chemical natures. In fact, they did the studies on those islanders, the healthy guys that died. that were stuck with needles from voodoo dolls, and they found out there was nothing wrong with them. They believed they were died, so they were died. So he spent his whole career showing how the brain and the body are directly correlated. And I'm in total agreement with this. Well, one of his colleagues that he works with, Dusek, at Mass General, Harvard University, he wanted to study the very genetics that we've talked about. And we now have this technology to see what turns on specific genes, these 54,000 genes. What turns them on? What turns them off? What do they do when they turned on? What proteins that they make? What does that regulate? So you can see how this is very important, because I want to know what the genes do, because that uphill regulates what the brain does. And this is so important because we're introducing worship, brain changes, as a treatment for chronic disease, as a solution to the world's health problems. So there's a very sophisticated study that he did, and he took 38 people. Remember, most of this studies like Newberg, it's not funded because there's no pharmaceutical industry that's involved in this. So they don't fund these things. You have to get the money on your own to fund these studies. So what he did was he got 38 people. 19 people were very good at worshiping, resting, relaxation. And this study wasn't about pure worship. They rested in other ways. One of the ways was prayer. One of the ways was meditation. So it wasn't a pure worship the way traditional Christians might worship, but there were some in that 19. And there were 19 that didn't care at all. He matched the groups, female, male, different races, the best he could with 19. And he took the red blood cells from their body. He studied the white blood cell count, white blood cells. He pulled out the DNA from the white blood cell, and from a sophisticated way called microanalysis, computers examined all of the genes in those patients, both the 19 that were worshiping and had rest and relaxation, and the other ones that didn't. Everyone follow me so far? Okay. He noticed that in those that had relaxation and rest from a variety of mechanisms, there were 2,200 genes that were expressed differently, that did different things, that acted differently. And he studied those genes, and those genes, we know what they do. And those genes were associated with stress and the body's effects with stress. All these things we talked about, these genes seem to be involved with. Problems, and we call this oxidation, aging, free radicals, all these complex ways that the genes turn themselves on and off. These 2209 genes were expressed differently in the two groups. So the next thing he did was he taught the people, the 19 who weren't resting in relaxation, he taught them how to do that through a variety of techniques. Some of them were praying, some of them were just deep breathing, some of them were doing yoga and other forms of relaxation. Then after that period of time, he studied their DNA, and he noted that 1,561 genes changed expression after he taught them how to rest and relax. This resulted in some of the same chemical benefits: better immune system function, lower stress chemistry in the body, less oxidation. Now, I can't wait till someone comes up to me afterwards and says, Dr. Markham, I'm going to write you that big check that you can actually study different types of worship and do some microanalysis and show how the DNA changes on that. But the brain changes because the DNA changes. We now have evidence showing that this is possible. This is called epigenetics. Did anyone not understand that? Because I'll go over it again. This is complicated stuff. So let's review a little bit the physiology of worship here. So we talked about worship, and worship really brings us to a relationship with God, to knowing God. And we know from the scripture that another word pops up. God is love. Remember, these are words representing complex neurologic and physical reactions that we can't. When someone says, I love you, what does that really mean? What's going on in the inside? It's much more complicated than a mere word. Well, once we start to love God, remember, to love God is to know God from that relationship coming to me. We also know, remember that text, 1 John 4:18, love casts out all. So we know that this physiology that's turned on casts out fear and anxiety, stress, basically. It casts out stress. So worship, knowing God, brings us to this physiology of love, which, come unto me and I will give you this rest physiology. The opposite of stress we could consider rest, physical, mental, spiritual. Come unto me and I'm going to give you this rest. It's a gift that we unwrap. It's a package that God gives to us. God might give one person a different package of rest than someone else. Worship's not the same for everyone, but God's promises and His faithfulness is constant. This is something we can depend on. We have the science now to prove it. Come unto me and I will give you rest. So we now see through science, Dr. Newberg's work, Dr. Dusek's work, how this changes our brain, turns down the stress chemistry, and even works at the very DNA level. So I'm proposing that worship, we now have the evidence that worship is a treatment for chronic disease, and worship is a solution to why we are sick. Now, you might disagree with me, but you have the evidence, and you hopefully have the Holy Spirit talking to you. Kayla, on the left, has had severe genetic stress. You know, some of us have stress and are born with things that we just can't control, no matter what we do. No medicines, nothing. Had severe genetic stress. This left her with severe autism. The brain doesn't work right. No one really understands it, but autism is just a devastating disease to have, and also left her with significant kidney disease. Kayla did not choose this life, and she spent time with her mother, Tabitha, who took care of her since birth, day one, gave birth, was there all the time, every moment of her life. Their routine, part of their routine, was Tabitha, who works full-time, supports the family, takes her to Orange Grove where they took care of her. Then at the end of every day, for her entire life, Tabitha picks her up, brings her home, takes care of her. Kayla doesn't talk. Kayla doesn't read. But she enjoyed watching TV and spending time with her mother. Kayla did not speak, and she communicated with gestures. And this has been the routine for Kayla and Tabitha for 25 years. Every day, every moment, this is their routine. Tabitha prays nightly, every night with Kayla. And when it's time to pray, Kayla requests this with a gesture. She touches her head, points to her forehead. And Kayla knows to do this, that it means something. Kayla comes into worship by gesturing and coming to God and praying in her own way. This is her worship. Worship is different. Tabitha, her mother, has faithfully cared for her daughter and put her daughter's interest above her own. I'm sure there's nights and days that she would rather be doing other things. When you put someone's interest above your own, that's worship in itself, because that's coming to the physiology of love. They slept together every single night of Kayla's life. Tabitha, through her example and her ministry of presence, 25 years, has shown Kayla what worship looks like. And Kayla has shown me what worship looks like to her. Unfortunately, in December of this year, Kayla, at age 25, passed away. And it was a medical miracle how she did so well for so long with chronic disease. And I can't even imagine, but can you imagine the loss that her mother felt? Now, Kayla had the best of modern medicine. Also, Kayla experienced worship. Kayla loved, and she came to God the best she could. And God was faithful to give her rest through a complex physiology in the brain and in life that we might not ever be able to explain this type of rest through science. Worship does more than turn off the stress chemistry. The gift, the rest that God gives to those who worship results in eternal healing. This might go against the crowd, but I think we've shown today that there's evidence that supports this. Most of us here cannot relate to Tabitha or Kayla. But if Tabitha and Kayla can trust God for healing, so can you and I. God is faithful. Science supports His words. Technology might be lagging in explaining everything, but as we've noticed today, physiology improves, and we're just beginning to understand. In taking this journey together, we might take one step at a time. The mountain might seem too big. But believe me, we have a hand, just like baby Hayden, we have a hand to hold on to that's going to help us. And we don't have to do it all, because as we worship, we experience grace. Christ makes up the difference. And I would like to introduce Tabitha today. She's here with us, worshiping. And Tabitha, would you stand up, please? Tabitha is here. I just wanted to acknowledge her. When we worship each day, each week, and over a lifetime, God heals in His way, in His time, and rest is the result, a treatment for stress, even if it's genetic stress. And even if today we just take a few baby steps, like taking a deep breath, understanding why we're sick, drinking more water, getting out in the sunshine, eating some more greens and beans, even if we just take a few steps, as long as we start understanding worship and doing that, we are going to experience eventually healing. We are dedicating the Biblical Prescriptions for Life series to the memory of Kayla and to her loving mother, Tabitha. They lived a life of worship. Now imagine. Can you imagine what heaven and the worship that we're going to experience there is going to do to our brains, and how it's going to turn on off all this stress chemistry, take away all the bad genetics? I'm looking forward to seeing Kayla there and the other ones who have genetic disease that we can't do anything about. But remember, healing changes our genes in ways we don't even understand. Can you imagine?
Thanks for tuning in to today's podcast. If you have any questions about today's presentation, you can submit them at biblicalprescriptions.com/podcast. And if you really liked what Dr. Markham shared, please leave us a 5-star review on whatever podcasting platform you're listening or watching on. I'm your host, Nick Evanson, inviting you to join us for another podcast next week where we'll discuss more about getting well and going home.